So, um, this is my book, Border of Water and Ice, the Yalu River in Japan's Empire in Korea and Manchuria. And when I start talking about my book, I usually begin with an introduction to the geography of the Yalu River, where exactly it is located and even situated. Now, for an audience like this, Yalujiang, you might be familiar already or have a vague sense of where the river is located. I know for many times when I'm speaking to primarily North American audience, they're not always sure. They're like, "Oh, are you talking about the Yellow River, the Yangtze River?" Not quite sure where exactly this river is. And so this river, though, the Yalu River, Yalujiang, is located here, as you see on the center of the map, um, in Northeast Asia, and together with the neighboring Tumen River, forms the border historically and in the present between the Korean Peninsula and a large part of Northeast China, which was historically known as Manchuria. It originates about 2,500 meters above sea level at the slopes of Mount Changbai, or Baekdu is in Korean, and flows eastward about 800 kilometers into the Yellow Sea. Now, for people who are interested in this region, if you were to just like do a search on Google, or maybe if you tried on Baidu, you might get similar results into Yalu River. You might get images like this you see at the top here, especially this is the case on Google. If you were to type North Korean Chinese border or something like that, you would see these images of border police, border guards, fences, surveillance. Um, it is known as a site of intense surveillance where the movement of people and goods is heavily controlled. But if you notice this bottom image here, you see two bridges, right? So this photograph on the bottom here is one I took myself. So I traveled to Dandong, which is on the Yalu River border, several years ago, and took this photo of two railway bridges. Both railway bridges were built by the Imperial Japanese when they were colonizing the region. Now, the bridge on the right was first built, completed in 1911, and then destroyed by the Americans during the Korean War. And then the bridge on the left was built by the Japanese during World War II and is still functions to this day. In fact, when I took this picture, I kept seeing cars and trucks going back and forth along this bridge between Dandong on the Chinese side of the border and Shinjuju on the Korean side of the border. And so what this shows is that this border today, yes, it is a site of where there's guards, there's surveillance and controls on the movement of peoples and goods, especially people, trying to leave North Korea to go to China. But it's also a site of active trade and exchange along bridges like the kind I saw when I visited myself. So the duality of the border as the site of both surveillance and exchange. This is a dynamic that's true now, and it's certainly true historically as well. Now, the period I examine of Yalu's history is not sort of the more recent modern period like those photographs, but rather the early 20th century, when the Yalu was an important periphery of an expanding Japanese empire. So the story of Japanese imperialism, modern Japanese imperialism, really begins with the creation of the Meiji state, the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Soon afterwards, Japan, the new Meiji state in Japan, in a bid to try to acquire more respect from Western powers and furnish its own national strength and prestige, annexes Okinawa. Oh, sorry. Try it again. Not sure why I did that. Is it good now? Can we see it again? Yeah. So takes over the northern island of Hokkaido, annexes Okinawa, and then in 1895, after defeating China in the Sino-Japanese War, colonizes Taiwan, and then in 1910 annexes the Korean Peninsula. Now, with the annexation of the Korean Peninsula, that Yalu River became part of the longest non-oceanic border of the Japanese Empire. And thus, it was this really strategic site for Japanese imperialists that were trying to control Korea, but also project power further into Manchuria, which was also a target of their ambitions, and eventually take over a whole Manchurian space in 1931. the following year creating the puppet state of Manchukuo, which it is in existence until 1945. So my story about the Yalu as a Japanese imperial border, which even after the Japanese take over Manchuria, it still is a border between these two different spaces. My story really focuses on the Yalu River and how the river itself, and especially its seasonal changes, shaped the politics of Japanese expansion in this region as it was trying to cement control over Korea and push power further into Manchuria. But before I go any further, I want to explain a little bit about how I became interested in this project in the first place. Because it wasn't quite so obvious that someone who looks like me, who grew up in small towns in Utah and Idaho, should study, the Yalu River in early 20th century Northeast Asia. Like this wasn't obvious, right? My earliest connection to East Asia actually came as a result of being a missionary. I was called as a Mormon missionary to South Korea, and I actually lived in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, this Busan area, so kind of on the opposite side of Korea from where the Yalu River is. I lived there for about 2 years, learned the Korean language, became really interested in Korea, its history, its culture, and also became quickly aware that Korea had a very complex relationship with its neighbors, like Japan, which is former colonial overlord, or like China, which still looms large in Korean political consciousness. And so, from this mission experience, I had this really deep interest in Korea and Korean history, culture, and its relationship with its neighbors that I wanted to explore further. Now, I also had an interest from a young age in environmental issues. And part of that came to different factors, including some pretty important experiences I had when I was young, including, if you see this image here on the right, this is a photograph of Zion National Park. It's a beautiful national park. I think it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. I'm a little biased, but I think it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's located in southern Utah, so the southern part of the state of Utah in the United States of America, near where I grew up. And so working there a couple summers when I was just starting college really gave me an interest in environmental issues. And I was interested in the park's ecology and had to learn about it for my job. And so once I entered grad school, I had this interest in history, East Asian history, culture. I also had this interest in environment. And that is when, say Shuxiong, my senpai in Stanford University, where I did my PhD, said, "Oh, why don't you study the Yalu River? It's this really interesting site. It's a river where Japan, China, and Korea all kind of like come together in one place and one time." I was like, you know what? That's a really good idea. So the lesson is always listen to your senpai, your seniors in college. They often have good ideas. Right. So now that I've explained a little more about how I came to this topic, why I became interested in it, I want to explain a little more about what the sort of central concepts are that support my work, that undergird it. And one of those is liquid geography. So this talk series really tries to highlight the importance of flows, connections between different spaces. And my book, I'm really interested, and I use this term liquid geographies to narrate this process of the flows that compose what I see as the flows that compose the border. These are flows of people, like these border crossers you see on this image, flows of imperial officials, but also non-human flows, flows of water, ice, sediment, timber, things that travel downstream and across the river. And so the liquid geographies of the border are these different flows that flow along, across, against the river. And how the Japanese colonial state, I argue, tried to channel, control, contain these liquid geographies in ways that benefited the imperial agenda. And how, in some cases, they were successful. They were able to strengthen their power in some ways through things like surveillance technology or infrastructure, or just putting more police on the ground. But other ways they were unsuccessful as different human actors or non-human actors, whether that be the Yalus itself, or human actors like anti-Japanese guerrillas or smugglers, subverted, were able to challenge colonial authority or evade it in different significant ways. Another key aspect of this project is the fact that these liquid geographies that the Japanese state tried to use to their benefit, but sometimes challenged it in particular ways, were also very much defined by seasonal changes in the river environment. The fact is that this space looked very different, whether you were upstream or downstream, but especially depending on the time of year. So this Northeast Asia, especially this part of Northeast Asia, gets very cold in the winter. And during this period, for about 3-4 months of the year, the river was completely frozen over, which totally changed the dynamic of mobility for people trying to police the border, like Japanese officials trying to control who and what can cross, and for people trying to evade that detection. The river also changed in other ways, like flooding during the summer. So there's these seasonal patterns that I see as really important. And thus I have this concept of seasonal border making for understanding how the nature of this border and attempts to create it and enforce it, and also subvert it, deconstruct it, take on very different forms depending on the time of year. And for historians, talking about history in terms of seasons and not just like years, decades, centuries is not always the most natural or obvious thing. I think a lot of historians like to write what I call very climate controlled histories, where we sit in air conditioned offices on our laptops and cafes and we're like writing things and not thinking all that much about how climate and weather and seasons really do shape the agencies of these different human and non-human actors along spaces like this in very important ways. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to try to convince you of this point, that seasons is really important, that we need to think about this border in terms of just not just the human actors like the Japanese or the Koreans or Chinese, but also the non-human actors as well, by taking you through the different seasons of Yalu River border policing. So I'm going to especially be focusing on part of my book where I look at how the Imperial Japanese tried to control the movements of what they called bizoku or hizoku bandits, and how through the rest of my presentation I'm going to look at this through the lens of seasonal change. So we're going to be moving first from the spring, then the summer, then autumn, and then finally the winter. So I hope that's an easy enough format for us to follow. I don't know, maybe in Hong Kong, like 4 seasons, like temperate climate manifests a little differently. But I think most of us are kind of aware of such a seasonal structure that I'm going to use it for the rest of the presentation. Okay? But I'm also going to be mentioning specific chronologically key events that change how these seasonal anxieties and manifestations occur along the border. Things like the March 1st and May 4th movements in 1919, or the Manchurian incident, September 1931. So let's first start, though, with the spring. So, as described by Japanese border policeman Matsuoka Shuji, the most cheerful time for colonial border police was not Shogatsu, like New Year's, or Obon. These are the days of traditional greatest festivity in the Japanese calendar. Rather, it was the brief about 3 to 4 day period during the spring when warming temperatures caused the ice on the frozen river to start breaking up. And once the ice started breaking up, then you had these large chunks of ice floating in the middle of the river that made it hard for people to cross. And so from the perspective of this border policeman, he's writing, he's saying, oh, this is like a really great time. We don't have to worry about the bandits crossing over the river. So from a period about when Japan dissolved the Korean army in 1907 until they officially take over Korea in 1910, there was these anti-Japanese fighters called Wibyung, righteous armies, that battled imperial troops. But by the early 1910s, most of this had been heavily suppressed, gone underground, and so this border was in a state this kind of tense peace. But then, in the spring of 1919, you have a couple key events that change this dynamic. First is the March 1st movement. So this is the the largest anti-Japanese protest movement in the history of colonial Korea. This happens in 1919. So these Korean activists, they're inspired by what's going on after World War One, and this U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, he has this idea that like countries should be able to determine their own fate. So they're like, yes, we want to determine our own fate too. We want to be free from Japanese rule. And so they stage a protest. And it's interesting, when they start this protest in Seoul, they pen this Declaration of Independence, which is filled with these seasonal metaphors. They say, a new spring has arrived, prompting myriad forms of life to come to life again. The past was a time of freezing ice and snow, stifling the breath of life. The present is a time of mild breezes and warm sunshine, reinvigorating the spirit. I mean, obviously, this is metaphorical, where colonialism is the winter, independence is the nice, welcome spring. But I can't help but think in late February in Seoul, when they're writing this, I mean, I was just in Seoul, it's very cold during the winter. Like in late February, they're also hoping for the arrival of a literal spring as well. And so these protests started in Seoul, but enveloped the whole peninsula, and started out non-violent, but as the Japanese responded with brutal suppression, many Koreans were motivated to take up arms as well and launch a violent protest movement against the Japanese, much of which took place in the Yalu borderlands. So many Koreans fled Japanese rule and went to Manchuria, so crossed the Yalu River to the borderland, where it was very mountainous, rugged, forested, and then started waging a war of resistance, a guerrilla war against the occupying Japanese. Now, that same year in 1919 was a key event in Chinese history, the May 4th movement, right, Wusu. And this movement was also anti-Japanese, partially anti-Japanese in origins, correct? And also caused many Chinese to become sympathetic to the Korean anti-Japanese movement, including Chinese in Manchuria, where many of these independence activists had gone to. So the spring, those all happened in the spring. So after every spring in 1919, you have the sort of explosive anniversary memory of these events. You also have the thawing of the river ice. I mean, that 3 to 4 day period when the ice blocks the movements, that ends. And eventually you have boats traveling up, down, across the Yalu. Now, the Yalu River, geographically, much of the river is very shallow. It's really hard, once you get past the mouth of the river near the Yellow Sea, to take really big boats upstream. So it's not like the Yangtze or like Changjiang or something like that. So the kind of boats that could travel far upstream were things like, you see this postcard on my slide here, these propeller boats. Propeller-fune, the Japanese call them. So there was these shallow bottom boats that had like these giant airplane propellers above the water. And they were like pontoon boats. They would like go upstream. The Japanese colonial government subsidized them, so they gave these boat owners money so they could operate. They were used to transport people, mail, so they're really important. And the colonial government in Korea also used them for border surveillance, for policing. So, for example, in 1924, spring of 1924, this guy here on the right, Saito Makoto, he's the Governor General of Korea, so he's like the top Japanese leader in Korea. He's on one of these propeller boats, and he's doing an inspection of the border along the river. So he's traveling up the river. Now, these propeller boats were really important, but they were also convenient targets for people who didn't like Japanese rule, like these anti-Japanese activists I talked about, who the Japanese called bandits. And in 1924, they fire, a group of them attack Saito Makoto, and they fire on him. He escapes. He's not injured. I mean, he's going to be killed later by an assassin, but that's another story. He escapes death in this case. But it causes a whole fracas. The Japanese blame the Chinese. They say, how did you let these Koreans come on the Chinese side of the river and fire on our leader? And the local Chinese official, Wang Yubin, he actually says, no, there was no attack. You just made this up. This is all made up. You're just making this up because you want to send your police across the river into Manchuria to cause havoc. And this was a common dynamic that I observed during this period, where you had Korean attacks being used as an excuse by Japanese police to then go into Manchuria, which angered a lot of Chinese officials. So the spring brings episodes like the one I just described as the river thaws, the ice goes, and it opens for river traffic. Now the summer, by the time we move into the summer was known as the flourishing season. So the spring, which I just talked about, was known locally as the thawing season, kayoki, heibingi. But the summer, this was the flourishing season, the hamoki or bomungi. This was a time when the vegetation on the river's banks was really thick, so it was much easier for guerrillas, especially people who are trying to fight the Japanese in small numbers and trying to stay hidden. There's more places to hide. There's more things for them to eat. And it's just a little bit easier to wage a guerrilla resistance during the summer. And so from the perspective of the Japanese border officials, this was also a really dangerous time for border security. You also have the fact that flooding happened. So along the Yalu River in this region, every about July or August or so, you get really heavy rains. This is like in Korean, they call it Changma. In Japan, they have the Suyu. These are like the certain times of summer rains. And Yalu, causes the river to flood almost annually during the summer. Its banks rise. And this could create a lot of challenges. In August 1921, for example, there's these 4 Japanese border police. They're riding a raft. So in this photo, they're riding canoes. And in this story, they're riding a raft when the river floods and the raft overturns and one of the policemen drowns because they couldn't swim their way out. Now, anti-Japanese guerrillas and just ordinary people living along the river were just as vulnerable, if not more so, to the dangers of Yalu flooding. But in the pages of newspapers and police memoirs and reports, there was this idea that this flooding was this particular unstable element of the region that presented a convenient opportunity for bandits to come and cause havoc. An August 26, 1923 article in a Tianjin newspaper described Korean guerrillas carrying out raids amidst the chaos of massive flooding that year. So different factors like this combined to make summer during this period in the 1920s, where I have these statistics for, the most statistically violent period of the border, as this graph shows. So I'm taking these colonial Korean police documents and looking at how they describe different incidents along the border, and you can see the month where you have the greatest number of incidents is August, right? And then July is number 2. Now, there's also a lot of incidents in January and March, which are technically the winter time. Why is that the case? I'll explain that a little bit later. Now, before I go any further, I just want to be clear that this seasonal violence along the border was not just a phenomenon that affected men. That this effort to violently constrain, control, channel the liquid geographies of the Yalu was not just a sausage fest. It was not just guys only. That in fact, women were very much imbricated in these seasonal patterns of violence in various ways. For example, on August 29th, 1925, so-called bandits or anti-Japanese activists attacked a Japanese police station along the border in the small town of Yangsan, killing the wife of one border police officer and the wife and adopted daughter of another. The deaths of these women really captivated the popular imagination back in Japan, especially in the Japanese home islands. And this image on the left is from a 1929 magazine article in the magazine Kingu, so it's like this popular magazine. Tells the story of one of these police wives. Her name was Kyoko, who was from Kyoto originally. She was a textile factory worker, but she married her husband, who became a police officer in colonial Korea, so she follows him to the border. Summertime is approaching. She's supposed to go back home to Japan for a family event. But she says, no, I'm not supposed to go back until the summer is over because this is the dangerous time. I need to support my husband. But it just so happens that one day he's gone, and that's when the bandits attack. And she supposedly valiantly defended the station with one of her husband's handguns that she found, and that's what's depicted here in the illustration. Um, but while women like Kyoko commanded a lot of sympathy in imperial magazines, border violence had a especially disproportionate effect on local Chinese and Korean women that were caught up in this anti-colonial violence or an imperial violence. This image on the right depicts Korean women that were driven to smuggle goods along the Yalu River by poverty. So that with little other choices, they're forced to smuggle goods and try to evade capture by colonial authorities. And you can see, it's an illustration, but you can kind of see the anxiety in their eyes as they're doing so. In 1924, one Korean newspaper ran a series of articles about how border police, which included ethnically Japanese police, but also ethnically Korean policemen working for the colonial state, were sexually assaulting, raping local women under the pretense of conducting investigations against bandits. So yeah, it was just a hard place to be, certainly. And these women were threatened by police, of course, when they tried to report these crimes. So after long summers of searing temperatures, high humidity, riverside raids, and these diplomatic tensions, the general consensus among Japanese border officials was that the Yalu autumn, the fall, was too short. It is usually said that a single falling leaf heralds the coming of autumn, is what one police officer wrote. But in the northern region of Korea, that does not apply. If you see a single leaf fall, that means winter's coming. It's like, it's over. Winter's on its way. The feeling was that you had this long, humid, hot summer, and then a very brief brief autumn before winter suddenly hit with full force. So, what discussion I did find in my sources about the autumn tended to focus on getting ready for the upcoming winter, what they called the icebound season. And those preparations included commandeering locals, like local Koreans, to build fortifications for police stations. So here is a photograph of a typical border police station along the upper Yalu River. And you can see it's like an old Korean style house that they've taken over, but they've built like this watchtower here. There's also barbed wire trenches. Like they basically equipped it like a mini fortress. And they're watching out against attacks by so-called bandits. Now, of course, in September 1931, on the eve of the autumn equinox, you have an event which really reshapes the politics of this border in a very dramatic way, in its seasonal politics as well, and that is the Manchurian incident. And this incident, you have the Kwangtung Army, these Japanese military officers who'd been in Manchuria stationed there since after the Russo-Japanese War. They stage a railway explosion, blame it on the Chinese, and use it as an excuse to take over all of northeast China. And once that happens, of course, the violence breaks out as, even though Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, decides not to resist the Japanese, many Chinese do, especially under the leadership of the Chinese communist guerrillas, and they join forces with ethnic Koreans who'd already been fighting Japanese for a while to launch this multi-ethnic resistance against the Japanese, which plunges this border region into this state of war. And this chaos, this border violence came to be identified especially closely with the wintertime Yalu. So let's talk about the Yalu winter. This was known locally as the icebound season. In Japanese, the kapyoki, or the gyolbingi in Korean. And winter, of course, meant a lot of different things. Once the river froze over, it was easier to move goods and people across it. You didn't need boats anymore. You could use sledges or just go on foot. You can use ox carts. And in some ways, this created, as this illustration suggests, a very lively commerce on the frozen river's surface. I mean, people would ice skate, they would cut ice to use. But from the perspective of border officials, it was also a very dangerous time where bandits can now cross the river at any point. The river used to be a kind of moat, but now it's frozen over. It's like a giant ice bridge. And after the Manchurian incident, it's interesting, you have repeated incidents during the winter that strengthen this idea that the winter poses this especially dangerous threat. In the winter of 1933-1934, and then the 2 winters after that, you have a succession of 3 major border raids, where in each case you have about 100 to 200 guerrillas crossing the frozen river, usually at night, to attack Japanese outposts. And the largest of these attacks was the battle in Tonghung, so this is 1935. You have about 200 people under the direction of, his name was Lee Hong-kwang. He was an ethnic Korean fighting for the Chinese communists. He leads about 200 people across the frozen Yalu border and a raid on the Japanese outpost there. Interestingly, if you see this on the side, it says the female hero Lee Hong-kwang. There was a rumor at the time that was reprinted in a lot of Chinese magazines too, that Lee Hong-kwang was a woman, that he was a woman leading this guerrilla brigade. And, well, he wasn't, but it is interesting that there were female combatants in his brigade. And the rumor may have started, according to one source I found, because some of those female combatants interrogated prisoners that they took. And thus they came away with the idea, oh, these were the leaders. So that's an interesting evidence of how, I mentioned gender briefly earlier, but like women were also implicated in the border violence kind of as fighters and not just as passive victims, as I tended to focus on before. Now, these anxieties border officials expressed about the winter and the fact that the river is now frozen over. We see this in the writings of probably the most famous Korean anti-Japanese guerrilla to operate in the Yalu region, and that's Kim Il-sung. So Jin Il-chung, he becomes, of course, the grandfather. He's the first president of North Korea. He's the grandfather of the current guy, Kim Jong-un. So he's a very important person in certainly Korean history, Northeast Asian history. He began his career as a guerrilla fighter and leader in the 1930s along the Yalu and Tumen borderlands. And in his autobiography, which is published many years later, he claims that the Japanese were so scared about the prospect of people like him crossing the frozen Yalu border that he says here, the enemy dragged out the people to break the ice on the Amnok, that's the Korean name for the Yalu, noisily every night to prevent individuals or groups of soldiers from the People's Revolutionary Army from infiltrating their homeland. How the enemy must have dreaded our attack to have devised such a childish defensive measure. And so, I mean, the source, it is propaganda. It is trying to make him look very awesome and his enemies look very stupid. And I have examined many Japanese sources from this period and have yet to find a single reference to them actually commanding people to break holes in the ice. That does seem like it's probably not a very effective means of limiting guerrilla mobility. But this anxiety that this alludes to, this idea that the Japanese are genuinely afraid of the ice as this kind of means of facilitating the mobility of these anti-Japanese resistors, this anxiety is something I've seen multiple times in colonial documents where they'll be like, telling Tokyo, we need more money, give us more boots on the ground, we need more money because winter's coming, the river's freezing over, we got to prepare for this. Here's an image from a 1933 border police photo album, Kokyo no Mamori, like protecting the national border. And it shows here, you see the 2 armed border police, they're interrogating 2 border crossers. And I found this photograph in a photo album in Waseda University Library in Tokyo, which I'm sure Yoja has worked, Professor Lee has worked at multiple times. And I remember being very excited when I found this image because of the sign in there. And I was like, what's on that sign? Because signs don't often survive in archives. Like historians, we read a lot of books, newspapers, papers. we don't read a lot of like signage. It's not like wooden signs will survive, get preserved in an archive. So when I saw in the photograph, I just had to know what's on this sign in here. So I remember borrowing a magnifying glass. I had to look up in Japanese what's the word for magnifying glass, and then ask the librarian, can I borrow a magnifying glass? And then looking, and this is what I was able to parse out. I couldn't get everything, but rules for travel on ice. Border crossings outside of designated areas are strictly forbidden. Travel outside of designated times is strictly forbidden. Travel at night is strictly forbidden. So this sign is trying to tell people how they can and cannot move across this frozen border. They're only supposed to do it in specific areas, in certain times, and not at night at all. Of course, seeing this raises some questions for me as a historian. First off, the sign is written in Japanese, which most people along the border, Koreans or Chinese, don't speak Japanese. Japanese literacy rates are pretty low. So how many people could even read this sign technically? Two, if you're traveling at night, I don't see any like spotlights or like lights on this sign. And so like, can you even really see the prohibition against night travel if you're traveling at night? And so maybe this sign, honestly, maybe it's more about projecting authority, being like, here's a sign. This is a border. Like when you travel to a national border today and you just see signs everywhere, right? Maybe it's more about that, the more to the display of power than anything else. But I just thought this is interesting evidence of how this border surveillance regime worked, especially during this specific season, during the winter, and how it shaped their rules. All right, so in addition to other measures, probably the most important thing from the colonial police perspective about strengthening their surveillance during the winter was just getting more boots on the ground. And we see this, I've looked at these different documents, so every quarter, so every 3 months, the Japanese police stations along the colonial Yalu and Tumen, they had to submit reports, like personnel reports, back to Seoul, like how many people are in each border police station. And looking at these different quarterly reports and compiling some numbers, I was able to get a sense of how the numbers fluctuate depending on time of year. And what I saw, you see in this graph, there's obvious like peaks and valleys, like high spots, low spots. And the peaks generally correspond to December, March, the winter months, and with the lower valleys corresponding to warmer months like June, September. So it really shows how this iced over period led to more troops, more soldiers being put on the ground. I mean, part of that reflects the fact that winter is a kind of double-edged sword from the perspective of border policing and border security. On the one hand, it does theoretically allow more people like Kim Il-sung to cross over more easily into colonial Korea. But from the perspective of the Japanese, especially those trying to hunt down people like Kim Il-sung or other Manchurian guerrillas, winter is also the time of year where they do most of their tobatsu, or their anti-bandit suppression. And why is that? Well, there was an interview, you can find it online, really fascinating, with this old Japanese person who was part of one of these like groups that hunted down Manchurian bandits or guerrillas. And he's like, oh my gosh, it was so cold in the winter, but that's when we were always doing things. Why did we always do things in the winter? Because we could track their footprints in the snow. It was easier to find people in the snow. There was fewer places to hide. We could track their footprints. The conditions were so rough, it was easier to induce people to surrender or kill them if you had to. And so there's a duality to the winter. And I think that also explains the rise in numbers, that they're worried about these bandits that are escaping and maybe crossing into Korea, but they're also trying to support pacification efforts in Manchuria that are going on. Right. Now, part of this mobilization for the winter is sending more police to the border, but part of it is also mobilizing ordinary people in border communities to do the work of border security, of border policing and patrol. In the case of the Korean side of the border, you have these self-defense corps, 자경단, GK-tan, that are composed of, well, supposedly volunteers, but I don't imagine most of these people were. I think they were more voluntold to do this. Um, Young men, like you see in this photograph, who are ordered. I mean, can you see their faces? You can see their expressions, right? Like, no one looks happy to be doing what they're doing. Um, these young men are basically told to every night, especially at night, they have to go on the frozen river during the winter and patrol it. So they go in like groups of two or three, um, and they're not given guns because the Japanese don't trust them with guns. So they're usually just given like large sticks. That's all they got, and they're making the rounds on the frozen border, supposed to look out for any sort of smugglers or especially bandits that might be trying to cross. And I've looked at some memoirs, oral testimony from people who were part of these when they were young, and they talk about just how terrified they were, like walking, doing the rounds on the frozen river, and just listening for any kind of strange sound. Um, Now, I also want to talk a little bit, a return to a theme I've hit on earlier about sort of gender and how women and men kind of experience this seasonal violence. And when it came to the winter, you had a lot of interesting coverage in Korean and Japanese magazines and things about border security that would mention, oh, these wives of the border police officers, they do so much to, keep home and hearth warm. So if when their husband is out on patrol and he gets frostbite and it's so cold, or he's hunting down bandits, he comes home to a nice, like, warm domestic space that's provided for by his wife, maybe some small children in tow. And here's a photograph from the same photo album I shared a photo from earlier. And it's interesting. It's kind of this family photo of like policemen at one border police station. Then you see two wives here. Obviously, two of these border policemen are married, and you can tell from their costume. One of the wives is Japanese; she's wearing kimono, and one of them's Korean; she's wearing hanbok. And and what's interesting to me is that a lot of the sources I could find a fair amount of sources about Japanese police wives, that were published in like Japanese magazines or things like that. But I could find like almost nothing about Korean border police wives. Like their story is just not really well documented. I think that for many Korean magazines, newspaper, they weren't really interested in telling that story. It was an uncomfortable one, perhaps. They'd rather talk about victims of colonial violence than women like this. Um, Sometimes I get asked, was there intermarriage? Was there Japanese border policemen marrying Koreans? I found one or two examples of that, so I think it happened a little bit, but it wasn't like extremely common. But you can also tell this photo is taken during a cold time because notice how like thickly bundled all the men are and the women, like they have gloves. It looks very cold. It looks a little uncomfortable. Um, Now, in my presentation today, I've mainly focused on policing. A big part of my book, I also talk about smuggling, so how people tried to transport goods across the river while evading imperial detection. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, like what kind of goods were smuggled across the river. But one thing I will say is that winter time was a really important time for smuggling. And that's when a lot of smuggling occurred. And according to one Korean newspaper, smugglers waited for the ice as eagerly as Christians wait for the coming of their Redeemer. Maybe that's a little bit sensationalist, perhaps, but it was very important. Um, Getting close to the end of my presentation here, I'll note that I talk about this in my last book chapter, that the Japanese built a huge dam on the Yalu River between 1937 and 1944, the Supung Dam. And other scholars have written about this as well. It's a really important project. It's the second biggest dam in the world when it's completed. It's made to produce electricity for places in Korea and colonial Korea and Manchuria. But what's also important about the dam is it changes the liquid geographies of the Yalu and this dynamics of seasonal border making in very important ways. Once the dam is finished, the river below the Supung Dam no longer freezes over. The, the, the dam changes the kind of temperature dynamics of the water in a way that the icebound season below the dam just doesn't happen at all in the winter. And so that's a very big change when you think about how important these cycles were. It's around this same time that Japanese suppression of guerrillas grows so intense that many people like Kim Il sung flee to the Soviet Union. And so construction of the dam caused many to exult that the Japanese, they'd conquered nature. That somehow this challenge posed by the liquid geographies of the border had been surmounted, finally. But that hubris is also the same kind of pride that caused the Japanese to overexpand their empire during the 1940s. And eventually, the empire collapses. Now, in the epilogue to my book, I talk about how the liquid geographies of the border continue to pose challenges to new sets of powers that emerge in this region, even after the Japanese leave, and how seasonal border making continues to be affected by stuff the Japanese did even after they're gone. And I'll just give one example. This is a famous image from the Korean War of Chinese troops crossing the Yalu River to go support North Korea against what they call the Meiji, right? The American imperialists. And if you notice, here's the river. This is definitely in the winter. It's in February 1951. This photograph's taken. But the river's not frozen over. They're having to cross on this makeshift bridge here. And the fact is like it wasn't frozen over because precisely of the effects of the Supung Dam, which was built less than a decade before this. Um, and so we don't often think when we see this image about what's going on under the soldiers' feet, but this is evidence of kind of changes to this region and how the liquid geographies continue to shape its politics even after the Japanese departure. So I'll just conclude my talk now by again expressing my gratitude to Professor Lee for this opportunity and reemphasizing, I think, my main point that when we think about, I would say not just this region, but when we think about borders in general, like if we think about border spaces, even if they don't have a perfect four-season structure like I narrated here, that things like climate, environment, landscape, geography do tend to shape bordering experiences in very profound ways, how people interact with borders, how states try to create borders and try to control the movement of peoples and goods across them, are often shaped in really fundamental ways by climate, by weather, by the environment, in ways that haven't always been, I think, thoroughly appreciated in previous scholarship. So I'll go ahead and conclude there. Thanks again. I really look forward to your questions and comments. Oh, and sorry. Last thing, I guess I had one more thing. This is my sort of chapter outline of my book. What I shared from today was mostly from chapter 3, Seasons of Yalu River Border Policing. I talked a tiny bit about smuggling in the dam from chapters 4 and 5. And oh yeah, of course I have to do this before I finally conclude. This is my QR code, shameless self-promotion. You can purchase the book, but you can also just download it for free. As Professor Lee mentioned, it is open access. So it's easily found online through various downloadable through the Cornell page, which is what I QR coded here, or in other ways. I would be thrilled if anyone decides to read it and learn more. Or you can just enjoy this presentation and just ask some questions. But again, thank you all very much. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. It's really inspiring to think about, rethink about how you think about time. I mean, like the cycles of seasons and layers. So I think let's just open up for discussions. For those who have questions, please just feel free to raise up your hands, or you can just, if you're shy, you can leave your comments on the chat. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of people online, and some of I think most of them are from Lingnan University undergrads, but there's also other scholars or students from other universities. So all are free to raise up questions and comments or even curiosities, um for the stuff that Professor City just introduce. While we're waiting, actually, I have a lot of questions
Okay, I was gonna
to
ask.
ask. I mean, like, I'll just start off. Wait. No, we have a question from Li Jia from Shangang. Okay, so it says, thanks. It was a very interesting speech. Besides the Yalu River, are there other historical examples of similar fluid spaces?
Oh wow, absolutely. I think something I wanted to highlight in my book is that the dynamics I identified in the Yalu in some ways are particular to this time and space, but other ways are very universal to other border spaces, especially in the modern period where borders have become so important as means of trying to both impede movement but also facilitate it. And as modern nation states have become much more sort of rigid in their definitions of where borders are, and I could give like a lot of different examples. Just in the case of China alone, if we think about China, I mean, the Yalu is one of the river borders, one of the rivers, the many rivers that comprise different border spaces in China, but we could think about others as well. I mean, just in Manchuria, you have, um, the Amur River forms part of the border with Russia and is also known for being a very sort of fluid, dynamic space. Heilongjiang is known for kind of flooding. It also ices over, and there's different other border rivers with Manchuria and Russia have also been the site of heated conflicts about sovereignty and things like that. So, I mean, that's just thinking in Northeast Asia, but we go beyond Northeast Asia. If we think closer to Hong Kong, you could certainly think of the Pearl River Delta as actually a kind of liquid geography, right? It is like a fluid border space historically and in the present, right? So I think of this concept of liquid geographies as having, I'd like to think it has a broader, certainly, applicability beyond just the Yalu River. And the Yalu is the context I'm most sort of comfortable speaking at length about because I've done the most research about, but I can certainly talk in the book. I also mention even sort of US borders like the St. Lawrence River, the US border with Canada, or the Rio Grande border between the US and Mexico, how you see some of these same dynamics. So thank you so much for that question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Um, I'll go ahead and ask one of my questions. Oh, it's
Yeah.
half a comment and half is a question. It's about, you were mentioning that season is this cycle of times, and so it's like a cycle of events happening. So I imagine
Mm-hmm.
it will be a set of knowledge that was built, in that community or around the border,
Mm-hmm.
or how to deal with this cycle because it
Mm-hmm.
happens repeatedly. So one thing that really caught in my mind is that you mentioned that one of winter is a good place. It is a good time to capture those guerrillas, right? The bandits
Yeah.
from the Japanese government, and they know it because they can tell the footprints of it, which reminds
Mm-hmm.
me of hunting because you also talk about
Mm-hmm.
like human and
Yeah.
human
Yes.
actors
Yes.
in your book, and you actually talked a lot about animals as well. So maybe can you tell us a bit more about how animal maybe like in this water will generate this kind of knowledge that kind of like
Yeah.
this help the border making from the animal's
Yes.
perspective.
Yes. Great, great question. So, I think talk about animals in a few different ways. One is like wild animals, right? Um, Now, this border region, not so much by the Japanese colonial period, but for centuries prior to that, especially during the, say, Qing dynasty and sort of the Joseon dynasty, there was a lot of hunters who would go to the Upper Yalu to pursue big game. Things like animals like tigers or leopards, bears, things that were like big fur bearing mammals that were very valuable if you captured them for their pelts or their body parts, which could be sold for Chinese traditional medicine. And winter was the peak hunting time because you can also track animal footprints better. Something like a tiger that is known for being notoriously difficult to capture becomes easier to capture during the winter. And so, especially during the pre-modern period between the Qing Dynasty and Joseon, there's lots of records about people in Joseon or Qing, especially Joseon, complaining about Chinese hunters crossing the frozen Yalu, pursuing um, their game and then setting up camp, which it was illegal. During that period, you weren't supposed to cross the border at all. So it's very different from the Japanese period where they're encouraging mobility, at least certain kinds of mobility, to further their project. During this early modern, pre-modern period, it was really about there wasn't supposed to be any cross-border movement at all, with the exception of a few tributary missions. Like no one was supposed to be crossing the border, but they often did, in part, to pursue game during the winter. So yes, that's one thing. And then in my book, I also talk about fishing and how fishing in the lower Yalu towards the mouth of the river, especially during the spring, was kind of a springtime event to catch miantiaoyu, like noodle ice fish, were a particular important kind of fish that were harvested along the lower Yalu, and they were known for congregating in the spring. So spring, for whatever reason, was like the season to capture those. But that seasonal harvest, as I talk about in my book, became a bone of contention between the Chinese and Japanese over who could harvest those fish and who was allowed to go in the border river. So yes, animal mobilities are very much affected by season and are a part of this dynamic as well. So that's wild animals, and briefly I'll just say domestic animals. I talk about a bit in my book as well, especially dogs. I mean, dogs. I don't know if you remember my book cover. There's a dog on it. Um, there's an image. It's got like five. There's like these five border police. They're like marching across the frozen on the banks of the frozen river, and then there's a dog. And dogs were a really important part of border policing. Border police wrote them about them a lot. They also wrote them out very sympathetically when the winter came, and they're just like shivering and cold. And pigeons too, interestingly, pigeons like birds. Pigeons were used to send messages. So you send a tweet. They were sending like messages by bird, because this border is very remote. And so if they're in the hinterland, border police are in the hinterland doing their missions to kind of kill bandits. Like, how do they send messages back? They don't have a cell phone. Like, um, you tie a note to the leg of a pigeon and you send a pigeon off. Except that didn't work super well in the winter because it was just too cold for pigeons. It was better in the summertime. You could fly pigeons easier, but police talked about how pigeons would sometimes freeze to death in the winter because it was just too cold. Does that help? Give some animal stories. I know you're a fellow animal historian. There isn't as much animal history in this book as some of my other projects, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Now we have another question from in the chat. Said, what role do you think media, such as newspaper and periodicals, play in the construction of fluid spaces?
Yeah. I mean, huge role, certainly. I think in terms of creating a kind of public imagination surrounding these spaces, they're absolutely really important. I mean, something I've looked at, um, one second. I did a project recently with a scholar, Sayaka Chitani, Dr. Sayaka Chitani. She's based in Singapore, where she was having me work with her students to translate sources. She has this whole online archive of sources about Japanese imperialism. And one thing I worked on with her, which I'll put in the chat if anyone's interested in, is working with one of her students. We translated a short story about a Korean smuggler who is trying to smuggle along the Yalu. And stories like this often featured in major magazines, newspapers, so that people even who lived far away from the border had this idea of what these kind of liquid geographies looked like, or they imagined they looked like, right? But I think these are also important. The colonial border police are very active, especially in North Pyongan province, which is one of the border provinces in Korea, are very active in kind of propagandizing their efforts. They create that photo album that I shared from. They have a special issue of the Asahi Graph they publish on border security. That's like Japan's Time magazine. It's like a huge magazine at the time. There's even a movie that comes out in the 1940s about Yalu border security. I think all of this was their campaign to try to get more resources for what they were doing. They were trying to sway public governmental opinion in a way to get more resources for what they saw as their sort of important role into protecting the imperial heartland. So yes, I think this media is all very important, and is of course very important to me as a historian when I'm trying to understand what's happening. So yeah, great question.
I think we have an audience raising up a hand. Dongjo, if you please just turn off your camera and audio and ask questions. Just feel free to do so.
All right. Can you hear me right? All right.
Yes.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
can.
Thank you for taking my question. And Professor Seeley, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and congrats on your book. And I have two questions, and I'd like
Yeah.
to ask. I mean, going back to the book cover, the cover page of
Yes.
your book, and the dog. And I'm also very interested in dog history in East Asia. I
Mm-hmm.
believe it's a growing field in East Asian studies these days. So my first question is, I was wondering if you're saying the dog was a police dog or just a stray dog,
Yeah.
and if it was a police dog, then what kind of dog was that? It was for example, like a German Shepherd that the
Mm-hmm.
Germans were back then the English England using like police dogs a lot, or any kind of like Japanese indigenous dogs or something like that. So after I listen to your answer to that question, I will ask the second question.
Yes. I'll just answer it really. Thank you for your question. So there was a preference for German Shepherds, certainly. They're seen as the kind of ideal police dog among colonial authorities. And there are some of my sources mention border officials having German Shepherds. There's one source I cite where the Andong customs, so the customs officers, they're trying to crack down on smugglers on the Chinese border, Manchurian border city of Andong. They import a bunch of German Shepherds that were actually ex-military dogs to try to crack down on smuggling. That said, I think a lot of the actual dogs around that were kept around stations, dogs like that accompanied police on patrol, like the one you see on my book cover, you can tell just by looking, they're not shepherds. These aren't German
Yeah.
shepherds. So I
Mm-hmm.
imagine they're just looking at that, they're probably mixed breed, just
Mm-hmm.
sort of dogs that are loyal and kind of kept along. Because shepherds were, again, prized as this kind of elite police dog, but they're also kind of expensive to breed. They're
Mm-hmm.
this foreign breed. Um, I don't get a lot of evidence that they were using like native Japanese dogs. Like they're not like
Mm-hmm.
importing like the Akita dogs or something from
Uh-huh.
Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Aaron Skabelund mentions this in his work Empire of Dogs. That sort of the
Oh, you're
native
right.
Japanese dogs, they're
Yeah.
important for sort of symbolism, but when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to sort of military and policing, they don't really play
Mm-hmm.
like a very important role.
Right. Right.
But yeah, your
Yeah.
second question.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. Yeah, I read that the Empire of Dogs, that book very interesting. I mean, I'm impressed by that scholarship. And my second question is, I mean, it has more to do with your the topic of that book. So
Mhm.
as I listened to your presentation, I became curious about the other Koreans that it
Mm.
seems that you focus on the anti-Japanese activists, but I
Yes.
believe there are a lot of pro-Japanese. And
Hmm.
at least according to Hyunok Park's book,
Hmm.
I think the title of the book is Two Dreams in One Bed.
Yeah. Yes.
A
Yes.
lot of, I mean, a lot of Korean settlers in the borderland
Hmm.
regarded Japanese as protectors.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm just curious how those I mean what the role of those pro-Japanese, I mean, pro-Japanese Koreans um, um, played, and how you deal with, if so, I mean, if any, how you deal with those pro-Japanese Koreans in the borderland.
Great question. I think this gets to the difficulty of kind of trying to understand sort of local sentiment towards the Japanese colonial occupation in the borderland. I think that's really difficult to try to reconstruct. I mean, we can really only talk about what people do, right? Like
Right.
anti-Japanese guerrillas fight actively. We can talk about local borderland communities who, like I mentioned with the Jagyangdan, are mobilized to basically police, right? And local communities are targeted by guerrillas because these guerrilla groups are known for sort of kidnapping and kind of like ransoming and like doing these different things to try to raise funds. And you can read that in a sympathetic light, or you can, like the Japanese did, read that in a very critical light, right? Like, oh, they're creating havoc, they're perpetrating violence against local communities, and it's hard to know like how these local communities felt about it. Like, um,
Mhm.
of course, because we don't have like the nature of the archive, right? We have like Japanese official perspectives, we have sort of guerrillas writing, we have a colonial media in Korea that's censored, right? And so, if people were like the only sentiment that was could be expressed was, yes, we're terrified of these bandits. We need the Japanese to like come help us. And maybe that's how they felt.
Mhm.
Maybe that's how they felt. But
Yeah.
we're not really kind of we're constrained by the nature of the archive, right?
Mhm.
And certainly retrospectively, I've looked at different retrospective accounts of Koreans who grew up along the border and then moved elsewhere later. And of course, none of them are like, oh, yeah, we hated the guerrillas. Like, we hated the anti Japanese activists. We love the Japanese. Like, no one's saying that in modern Korea, right? So, this is a great question. It's like a really
Yeah.
difficult one
Yeah.
to answer with any kind
Yeah.
of like
Yeah.
convincing finality, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I also writing a book about, I mean, ethnic Koreans in the Yanbian
Yes, yes, yes. I'm familiar
Korean
with your work.
prefecture. Yeah.
You
And
wrote a
yeah,
chapter for
my reviewers are asking about those pro-Japanese. And it's just like you said, I'm a historian, and my sources doesn't do not tell about those pro-Japanese feelings and sentiments. So yeah, I
yeah, yeah,
definitely feel the
yeah.
same.
I
Thank you very
empathize. Yes,
much. Yeah.
good
Yeah.
work. Yeah. Um, let's see,
Thank you so much
Rosalie. It
for
looks like there's a question here in
the
the chat.
question here. I'll just read it. Thank you for this wonderful speech. I have a question about aids to navigations on the Yalu River, such as beacons or envoy. Upon a very brief browsing, I think you mentioned that in the book. Could you tell us more about these navigation infrastructures? Were them a big project or insignificant because of the ice?
Okay, great question. So, first off, it's a great question. Second off, I'm really flattered that you already went looking through the book to answer your question. But I'll try to offer an answer here orally. So, navigation buoys, beacons were important, and part of the seasonal cycle of the river is that when the river freezes over, you have to remove these because, yeah, you don't want them to get trapped in the ice and then break or something. So, yes, part of the seasonal cycle is once the river unfreezes, you put these out in specific spots. When it freezes, or before it freezes, you take them off. Now, these beacons and buoys and navigation markers become a kind of bone of contention between Japan and China. Because when Japan takes over Korea, they start insisting that they should have kind of exclusive right to setting these up. And when the Chinese side says, "Hey, shouldn't we like work on this together? This is kind of technically a shared border." The Korean, I should say, the colonial Korean authorities, the Japanese authorities in Korea are like, we don't trust you. Like, we're gonna keep doing this. Um, and so then when Manchukuo comes along, now there is ostensibly a Japanese colonial regime in Manchuria. What's interesting to me is that the same problem and sort of argument continues. That the Manchukuo government is like, hey, shouldn't we have some more say in kind of setting up these navigation markers. And initially, the Korean government's like, colonial Korean government's like, no, actually, no. We've been administering these. We're gonna keep doing this. And it takes a little time. It isn't until like the mid 1930s, so it's several years after the Manchurian incident that they finally kind of work out a sort of agreement that they're both going to administer these river navigation markers. But for the longest time, it was kind of the colonial Korean side doing it by monopoly. They said it was because they were the only ones sort of actually going to do it well, but I think it was really a way of kind of solidifying Japanese imperial power. But the fact that Manchukuo and Korea went head to head about it shows that there's these imperial tensions, these intra-imperial tensions too. So, but good question. Good question.
Any other questions? Please feel free to raise up your hands or leave comment.
Hi, can I ask the question?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. I noticed in the books that there's a concept called the weapons of the week have been mentioned several times. It's all about the resistance by the timber laborers. And could you share your observation how they conduct their weapon of witness to conduct their resistance to the authority?
Yes, great question. So, Weapons of the Week is not my coinage, which of course I acknowledge in the book as well. That's James Scott. He's a much more brilliant thinker. You can see recently passed away, rest in peace. But what I see is evidence of these strategies, Weapons of the Week, where these marginalized groups are using different measures at their disposal to try to fight back, resist these much more stronger hegemonic structures. What I see is I'll give you one example of that in my book, something I didn't talk about in my presentation. This is from my first chapter of my book. I talk about how in the Yalu region there were many trees. It was very forested. And there was many lumberjacks, timber cutters who would cut down these trees for their job, and many of them were Chinese. They were Chinese migrants from Shandong province who, Changguan, they'd gone over into Manchuria, and they're very poor. This is really back-breaking hard work, as you can imagine, to cut down trees for work. And every summer, as I mentioned, in the summer, the Yalu often floods. It floods its banks. And what that means for timber cutters is that they would cut their trees and try to build these nice stacks of logs, these piles of logs, and then the river would flood and wash everything away. And it used to be, the system was if the river washed away a log, it was kind of finders keepers. If you found a log somewhere else, you found it, you could kind of harvest it and sell it. But then when the Japanese started expanding into the region, they wanted to monopolize the Yalu timber industry. So they set up different companies to basically take over timber cutting in Korea and Manchuria along the Yalu. And now that it floods, they say, well, we have a system. If it washes up on the Korean side of the river, it belongs to the colonial Korean government and their forest bureau. If it washes up on the Manchurian side of the Yalu, it belongs to this, what they call the Yalu River Timber Company, which was supposed to be Chinese and Japanese owned, but was really a Japanese colonial company. So these Chinese timber cutters, these migrants who've been working for decades in this region, they're like, no way. We used to be able to just kind of harvest these logs at will, and now you're saying that you're going to control all of this. We don't like this. And so I invoke Weapons of the Week as when I talk about how there was these cases where the summer happened, they flooded, they get angry, and so these muba, these Chinese timber cutters, would start attacking Koreans and Japanese that were employed by the Japanese timber companies and kidnapping them and beating them and doing other things. They burned a Japanese timber company office as a way of being we don't like this set of affairs. We want the sort of old system. This is threatening our livelihood. And how the Japanese initially tried to suppress it, but eventually had to kind of compromise and be okay, fine. We'll change the system so it's a little easier for you to make money, and we'll hire more Chinese timber cutters. We'll try to do what it takes. So in some ways, the Japanese authority wasn't always, this is one of their limitations, and the weapons of the weak sometimes worked. So that's just one example. There's others I can mention in the book. That's just one that comes to mind. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Any other questions? If you have questions, please feel free to raise up your hands or just go ahead and hijack this channel. That's totally fine. If not, I have a final question about smuggling.
Yes, please.
Because you also mentioned gender and smuggling, I feel very fascinated about how you talk about women on this border that involved in violence, marriages, and a lot of labor, right? And the way I know about smuggler, I read his book on the Zulu zone, which talks about the smugglers. A lot of them are kind of females because they're more kind of secretly passing along like goods and stuff. I'm just wondering if you see the same pattern across this border, and do you think that so maybe, and what kind of stuff that they're smuggling across the border?
Oh, great. This is a fantastic question. Because I spend a good chunk of like my chapter 4 talking just about this. The fact that it's absolutely a very gendered enterprise. And the image I shared earlier was of women, right? Of female smugglers specifically. And there's a difference in the way that the colonial media tends to talk about smugglers, about women smugglers versus male smugglers. Whereas male smugglers are often depicted as more kind of violent and kind of gang-like. They're more in these like big collectives that are pushing goods like kind of bulk goods like cloth or rice or things like that across the border. And if they are confronted by officials, they fight back, they like attack. Whereas female smuggling is seen as like, not quite as violent, as more subtle, and small groups of women or just individual women crossing the border with just like goods carried on their body, like alcohol, like small bottles of alcohol, or salt, like sacks of salt, or maybe a little bit of opium, gold, silver coins that they hide in various places, including in their female region, as they try to cross the border. Now, some of the Japanese sources, they very much say, they literally say stuff like josei tekimitsu or dansei tekimitsu, like female, feminine, and masculine smuggling. Like, I've seen this. And some of these sources kind of have this like this sort of gentility that's like, oh, we feel bad for the female smugglers, and it's kind of understandable that you wouldn't like crack down on them super hard because their life's hard, and right. So you see that in some sources, including writings by border police. And yet there are also accounts that kind of belie this gentility, that talk about women getting beaten, sexually assaulted. There's a report I cite about how a woman was like pregnant crossing the border, but the border official thought she was just hiding smuggled goods, and so beat her stomach really savagely. And so like things like that. So yeah, on the one hand, there's this kind of like, oh no, women, we're like easier on them, and then it's like, not really, actually. But there is, I think, a subtle difference in terms of like the scale of the smuggling and the types of goods between the sort of men and women. But yeah, that's a really sort of interesting, important aspect. So I'm glad you asked about that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for any yeah. So if there's please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, this is Philip. I have a questions for Professor Seeley. Thank you for sharing this valuable content. And I have a simple questions about the river, but not the Yalu. It's to talking about the smuggling, the border river in the north of China. I think Yalu River is one. Another one is a Tumen River. So there's a film. It's called "Is Tumengang." It's by the Korean Chinese director Zhang Lu in 2010, I think. So a very important part for the Chinese, the Korean group in China and North Korea. But as I noticed, still right now in winter, yes, some Korean refugees cross the border to China. So I think this is another important part. Do you have any studies on Tumen River?
Yes, absolutely. The Tumen River is very important. It's not as big as the Yalu. It's not as long. It is not at the site of as much industrial development during the colonial period as the Yalu is. We don't have dams built on it. Bridges are built on it, but later than the Yalu. That said, it's still a very certainly important site of flows. It has its own unique liquid geographies. But there's a lot of overlap between kind of the dynamics I share in my book and what's going on at the Tumen at the same time. In terms of other studies of the Tumen River, so some of not in the book. In the book, I kind of made the decision to focus on just one particular river, but in some of my articles, I've looked at both border rivers. So I published an article, for example, on border disease control when it came to cattle disease and how the Japanese tried to police the movement of pathogens and viruses that infected borderland cattle. And that study looked at both the Yalu and Tumen, so kind of the whole borderland. And then I'm in the process right now of finishing an article on opium smuggling that also happens to look at the Yalu and Tumen. So yes, I'm certainly familiar with that region, and some of my studies touch on it as well. This particular book, I decided to focus on just the one river. But there's also scholars who've written different studies of the Tumen River borderland that are really interesting. Of course, in Chinese and Korean, but in English as well. I can think of Alyssa Park, Yan Shin Song, and Hyunok Park, who was mentioned earlier by Dong Joshin, are all examples of scholars who've looked at the Tumen River borderland. So, yes, definitely a place I've thought about, published some work on, even though this book tends to focus mainly on the Yalu. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, host.
You.
Thank you so much. And if there's no further questions, I think we have already a very fruitful and productive talk. And thank you so much, Joseph, for joining us. On the screen is the QR code for the Lingnan students who wants to scan and for attendance. So please feel free to do so while we're doing this. And yeah, so thank you again, Joseph, for joining us this morning and your evening and giving us this very thought-provocative talk.
Thank you
Yeah.
again, Professor Lee, and thanks to all of you for,
search on our